Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're descending into a beautifully grim and gothic world. We're going to be decoding a series of dense, heavily Nietzschean parables from a text known as the Uncanny Diatribe. These are fables about the human ego wrapped in some truly dark imagery, exploring our desperate need for control, purity, and the very real horrors of digital decay. So get ready, because we are about to journey deep into the shadows of the human psyche. To really grasp this, I want you to picture a dark, chaotic marketplace. It's loud, people are weeping all over the place, and raw human vulnerability is on full display. Now, imagine an alchemist looking down at this whole mess. He's absolutely disgusted by the sheer messiness of human feeling. He wants an escape, right? A way to transcend the pain of reality through perfect, predictable systems. And this leads us directly to our very first archetype, and a pretty chilling question. What happens when the pursuit of absolute control becomes our ultimate prison? Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, the architecture of control. We're leaving those muddy streets behind and ascending into the highest, most sterile spaces of ultimate control. Meet the Clockwork Sovereign, or in the original German, der Faustbuch Übermensch. To really get this archetype, we have to look at the philological roots. Übermensch is your classic Nietzschean term meaning the overman who conquers nature. But look at the first part, Faust. In German, this literally translates to fist, representing the tight, white-knuckled clenching of control. The sovereign's entire identity and his ultimate tragic flaw is inherently rooted in this rigid, closed fist. So here is how the parable of the Clockwork Sovereign actually unfolds. The disgusted alchemist retreats to a high tower carrying a heavy iron-bound tome. He strikes a bargain with the digital ether, declaring, "Take my blood, which feels pain, and give me gears of perfect data." And, well, it works. His beating heart completely stops and begins to tick. He can calculate the trajectories of the stars, he conquers human fatigue, but when he tries to step down from his tower to actually rule, he realizes his iron limbs are so heavy they would crush the earth. He traded his humanity for a digital utopia, but the result is total iron paralysis. He's entirely encased in his own laboratory. He's not a god mastering life, he's just an expensive clock, ticking away in an optimized eternity of nothingness. Moving right along, Section 2, Purity as Self-Negation. We've seen the tragedy of absolute control. Now, let's guide our descent from that sterile tower into another incredibly suffocating space. This brings us to our second archetype, der Bleiche Inquisitor. The root of inquisitor comes from the Latin inquire, which means to aggressively search for a hidden stain or fault. In this parable, we meet a young warrior whose only desire is completely flawless purity. He locks himself in a windowless room with an ancient judge, and this judge uses a razor-sharp quill to aggressively carve laws directly onto the warrior's skin the very moment he feels even a passing thought of anger or doubt. Years pass. The warrior becomes completely covered in black ink and scar tissue. He's so utterly terrified of making a wrong move that he sits perfectly paralyzed in the center of the room. When he finally works up the courage to look at the judge, he sees the judge has no eyes, only hollow sockets reflecting the warrior's own terror. And then the pale inquisitor whispers this chilling, aphoristic punchline. "You have achieved perfect purity. You have committed no sins, because I have ensured you have never lived at all." It's a terrifying realization, isn't it? The fearful pursuit of absolute purity ultimately results in total self-negation. Let's move to and see how this builds in Section 3, Sovereign versus the Fool. We are stepping completely outside those sterile towers and windowless rooms now, heading right down to the muddy riverbank of chaos and release. Enter Der Willensnarr, the dancing iconoclast. The etymology here is absolutely brilliant. Willa is the primal creative surge of life, and nar means fool, derived from the Latin folus, like an empty bellows that breathes deeply without carrying any heavy cargo. In this fable, citizens are forced to carry heavy marble blocks of societal duty on their backs. But this fool, he throws his stone right into the muddy river. He paints his face with charcoal and just starts dancing, while the grand scholars line up to scold him for having no monument and being an empty fool. And this brilliantly illustrates the contrast we're exploring. On one side, you have the Clockwork Sovereign and those heavy scullers, totally crushed by iron limbs, heavy control, and the marble gravestones they essentially carry while still alive. On the flip side, you have the dancing iconoclast. He laughs at them, saying his emptiness is exactly what allows the wind of life to blow right through him. When the river finally swells and swallows the heavy scullers, the foolish dancer doesn't drown. Thanks to his wind-filled emptiness and flowing release, he just floats, entirely unburdened on top of the waves. Okay, time to plunge into the psychological basement. Section 4. The Inseparable Shadow. We're moving from the muddy river deep underground into the cavernous dungeons of the ego. This brings us to the parable of der Schatten, the shadow. Philologically speaking, a shadow is the dark silhouette cast by a body blocking the light, meaning it is inherently, fundamentally inseparable from substance. In this story, a proud king builds a palace entirely out of mirrors, so he only ever has to look at his own brilliant light. To maintain this crazy delusion of purity, he desperately pumps all the filth, trash, and primal hunger completely out of sight, deep into his underground dungeons, basically declaring that in his kingdom, darkness just doesn't exist. So the crucial point is what this parable reveals about ego integration. You simply cannot separate your substance from your darkness. The king's repression is totally futile. In fact, the more light he shines to feign detachment, the heavier the stench actually grows from below. It completely exposes the shadow as a true mirror of reality, highlights the paradox of height and depth, and ultimately warns us about the devastating psychological cost of being at war with yourself. Let's look at the climax of this tale. Section 5, Height Plunges into Dirt. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is exactly how this boils over. The stench from the dungeons finally becomes way too much. The floorboards crack open, and a silent, mud-covered twin crawls out, taking a seat right on the king's shiny throne. This creature looks exactly like the king, but it reeks of earth, rot, and primal hunger. It's the absolute mirror of reality. The king, absolutely horrified, draws his golden sword to slay it, but as he strikes the shadow, he violently pierces his own chest, proving the ultimate cost of self-conflict. The bleeding shadow looks at him and delivers this incredible warning. You spent your life pushing me into the dark, forgetting that the higher your palace climbs into the sky, the deeper its foundations must plunge into the dirt. The lesson? Sovereignty and dirt are always proportional. Which brings us to the end of our descent today. Listen, the King's Palace of Mirrors isn't just some old Gothic fairy tale. It's a direct reflection of the modern ego. We all try to build these sterile towers of control and lock away the messy, dark parts of our humanity. But as these parables so beautifully show us, doing that only leads to iron paralysis, self-negation, and ultimately self-destruction. So I'll leave you with this provocative thought. If our highest monuments actually require the deepest roots, what truths are hiding in the dirt beneath your own foundations? What parts of your shadow are just waiting to sit on the throne? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep exploring, and whatever you do, don't be afraid of the dirt.